Hey guys, so I just want to do a little bit of a review for Romanticism and the other two movements that kind of fall under that category, which are Transcendentalism and Dark Romanticism. So when we started talking about Romanticism, or you started researching it, I should say, I hope you guys were noticing a lot about that individuality and nature elements that kept popping up. So this actually carries through all three of the movements. So individuality, and nature. So remember what I said about literature, it goes back and forth and back and forth. So we are going into our individualist kind of movement after we just got out of a very group-oriented movement with the revolutionary period. So based on the presentations that your classmates are popping up with, you guys seem to have a really good handle on the basics for the different movements, as long as you've checked out somebody's PowerPoint for each one or other presentation method. Most people picked PowerPoint or some kind of Word document. But keep in mind that the general idea is that all three movements are focused on individuality and how to become basically more like self-reliant or self-connected. And the big push for this is after we've been very, very dependent on Britain for so long, there's a big push again for people to be very individual, very different, which is the first time we've really thought about this in American history. So we're now finally America, and we're thinking about, okay, what makes us American? What makes us different from other places? What makes us an individual? We still see a lot of traces of this today, so we're very, very interested in being different and being connected, but our own unique person. So this movement still kind of carries on today, even through other stuff. The big idea was, though, that they had finally what was known as an American voice. And actually, our friend Walt Whitman over here was classified as the first American voice. So, first American voice. All right. So under the Romantic category, anybody who read or researched the Romantic era stuff that I posted in that project, they would have read a text by Walt Whitman, I Celebrate Myself and Sing Myself, which is part of a bigger poem that is called Song of Myself, which is part of a bigger work that is actually called Leaves of Grass. So he is classified as the first American voice. He does a lot of different things that people hadn't really seen or wasn't really something popular to do at this time. So he definitely talks in the first person. We definitely see a lot of first person throughout this entire movement, because we also see that in Transcendentalism as well as Dark Romanticism. All the texts that we talked about this week last week, are essentially first person. And they are also first person singular. Remember, that's that I rather than we, which would be first person plural. So very, very positive movement. They're very much talking about how people are good for the most part, and they do good things, and they have good things to say, like you're born good, which honestly was not something that was thought of at this point. Because remember, going back to Puritanism, Puritans believed unless you were baptized, unless you were one of the elect, you weren't good. So this is kind of like a 100 percent difference. Literally, we switched, did a whole like 180 there, about face, if you will, and said that everyone initially started bad to going, well, everyone starts off good, and then, they get to make those choices from that point forward. And again, it's all about that individual person, not that group anymore. So we started off with colonial literature being the individual. We then moved on to the revolutionary literature movement, which was definitely group-related. And then finally, we're back with individualism.
Attention all staff. Mr. Bernardi will be out front with your package when you leave the building today. Everybody have a good day.
Um, we next have transcendentalism. So transcendentalism, I want you to think of transcendentalists, people who wrote in this movement, as kind of like the ultimate literary hippie. Everything is about peace, love, harmony, nature, wonderful greatness. All right? So they thought people were amazing, people were good, and people were always good, even if they make bad decisions. At the internal part of them, the most inner, deepest part of them was always still good. Now, do we necessarily believe that today? Not so much, but this is kind of what they thought. That's how they approached literature. Typically, this group was very religious. If I could spell religious, that would be great. So they were very religious. The movement also kind of like the go-to person for transcendentalism is definitely going to be Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson she's a lady who never left her house. So it's really hard to see the bad in people when you never leave your house. So she read a lot. She lived at her house, which was actually called Homestead. So if you ever read any of her poems and she's talking about Homestead, that is actually the name of her house. Her house had a name. It was a very, very large estate. It was a lot of land and whatnot. And her father was like kind of a big deal in her dad's religious circle. He was kind of a big deal. But she lived at home her entire life. She never got married. She really didn't have a lot of friends. She didn't go a lot of places. She did a little traveling, but not anywhere far for any long periods of time. She pretty much stayed at home. And became what was known as a spinster. So she never married, she never had children, she never had a family. She just lived with her parents her whole life. And she actually didn't publish many of her works. A lot of her work was seen as grammatically insufficient. The grammar wasn't very good according to the standards of the time. So she actually got knocked a lot for using what is known as the dash. So dashes and hyphens, first of all, are different things. Hyphens connect two words. Dashes, you kind of use them like commas in a way. So they kind of break apart something and they'll like stop, they'll interrupt a sentence, but it's like kind of like the cool way to interrupt your sentence rather than using commas, which is seen as a little bit more formal in structure. So we can think of dashes kind of like the cool comma. And again, it's a little less formal, so we're going to call that kind of informal grammar. When we have this informal grammar, that tells us a lot about her as a writer. She was pretty chill. She was, not really worried about convention. She also, as well as Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe, used free verse. Free verse is when basically it's a poem that doesn't have a rhyme scheme, that doesn't have a meter, so it doesn't have a da-da-da-da-da-da, it doesn't have any kind of rhythm or rhyme to it. It's just written in a poetic form, which is what all three of these, I'd argue, are actually doing. They're all kind of free-form poetry. But she's really, really big on that free-form poetry, and part of that is using those dashes. So notice that her text, as well as the Edgar Allan Poe text, actually end in a dash. Dashes connect things. So if dashes are kind of used like interrupting, but it continues to pull you through the sentence.
Brianna Williamson, please come to the office. Brianna Williamson, please come to the office.
Sorry about that, guys. So we have free verse, dashes. Dashes typically connect parts of sentences, whereas hyphens connect just two words. So if you say something is yellow-green, it would be yellow-green. Versus if you have whole phrases, which would be using dashes instead of hyphens. So those dashes kind of, they're supposed to connect multiple sentence parts, but why would it end in a dash then? Seems interesting that they would leave it ending in dashes. My theory is that, it keeps going. So for Emily Dickinson's poem, for example, it's called Because I Could Not Stop for Death, where she talks about her journey with death to the afterlife, because she is religious. She does believe in an afterlife, so she assumes that's where she will be going, whatever version of afterlife she thought she deserved, whatever that may be. So she's talking about how death isn't all that big of a deal. It's like a little bit of a journey to get, to the afterlife, wherever you're trying to go. But it's not that big of a deal. It's not something to be afraid of. And she kind of, again, is showing that super, super people are amazing and religious ideas, but she's also pulling in that people are good, and that self-reliance and individuality. She believes this, and she really thinks each individual person will experience this as they move forward into their afterlife, on their journey to the afterlife. Because remember, everyone will die eventually. That's just how it is. We can't stop death. She could not stop for death. Death had to stop for her. So you live your life, you're going, you're moving, you're going, you're living, and then you die. So she's on this journey of life, and then she dies, and now she's on this journey to the afterlife. Rather than just dying and it ending there, she kind of talks about what it's going to be like to get there. And again, she uses that free verse, and of course she doesn't know everything that's going to happen, so she kind of leaves it off as a dash because it continues. Her life will continue in the afterlife versus just dying with death as we think of it kind of today. This moves us into dark romanticism, which is basically the opposite of romanticism. It's the opposite of transcendentalism. So whereas transcendentalists think that people are amazing all the time, dark romantics are kind of like people are good and bad. So they have both qualities. But because the other two movements really do focus on people being good, people tend to focus more on dark romantics talking about negative things. So for example, I had anybody who looked at the dark romantic movement look at Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is typically known for doing very negative texts. He is pretty poor throughout his actual life. He isn't famous during his lifetime. He publishes things, but he barely makes ends meet. He actually was so poor that he couldn't afford the medical care for his wife, and his wife actually did pass away because he wasn't able to give her the proper medication and comforts that she needed while she was sick. So, again, dark romantics talk about the good and bad in humanity and society. He's writing this poem alone about, feeling alone, having those darker emotions that he's not really sure what to do with, trying to work through those things. Dark romanticism, again, carries through a lot of individuality and nature. It also talks about self-reliance and connection. It's typically written in first person. Alone is written in first person. It uses these dashes and whatnot from transcendentalism and that free verse style as well. So we see a lot of these things popping up again and again. But the big difference is that romanticism by itself is the major movement. These are kind of like additional flavors of romanticism. So if romanticism was an ice cream, if romanticism was all ice cream, these are flavors of the ice cream. So this may be chocolate and this may be vanilla, but they're all ice cream. So transcendentalists, again, the hippies of the world, they always think the glass is half full, and then they're very optimistic. And then we have our pessimistic bunch, our glasses half empty folks here in the dark romantic category. So Emily Dickinson and Edgar Allan Poe were actually both slightly published in their lifetime, but mostly unknown. Now they are super, super famous, and ironically, a lot of their work wasn't published until after they died. So Emily Dickinson's work, almost all of it wasn't published until after she was dead. And we also don't know how much of her punctuation was changed when they actually decided to publish, because the few times that she got published during her lifetime, we talked about the fact that they didn't really care for her dash usage. A lot of times they would change it to more standard punctuation like commas and periods, which would ultimately change her meaning a little bit, so she didn't publish very often. Poe, on the other hand, was published frequently, but a lot of his stuff was actually published after he was dead. He was extremely bad off on drugs and alcohol, and I think that actually did contribute a lot to his death. So just kind of keep those things in mind, that there's a lot of famous people who actually don't get famous until after they're dead. It's called posthumous. So if you ever hear me say posthumous publication, I mean after death publication. So they're posting their works, or they're publishing their works after the author is dead. Please let me know if you have any additional questions. I'm going to have this up for Romanticism. I'm also going to have a review video up for where we are time-wise, and kind of move into our next unit, which is going to be talking about realism, and I will have, some notes posted for you guys fairly soon on that as well. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help, guys. Always here for that. Let me know.